My name is Samantha Despain, and I will be presenting uh, the influence of alternative sanctions instead of incarceration. So, the history. I shall define what an alternative sanction is. So, an alternative sanction is a punishment option that lies on a continuum falling between probation and incarceration. Um, Although after doing the research on it and what my paper is about, you will see that this continuum that is defined in this definition isn't perceived by all. Um, Alternative sanctions originated in the United States and the United Kingdom, and now we're gonna go into when it kind of started. So the period of time where we needed something else because crime rates just went up. So the rising crime rates started in the 1970s, and this kind of led to like a public outcry for more severe punishment. And this rise in crime continued to the 1980s, and this, coupled with the failure of treatment programs, led to a kind of rediscovery of the neoclassical retributive principles. Um, so by 1987, 3.2 million people were incarcerated. And by the 1990s, there were already 4 million people incarcerated. So this is a huge increase. Later, sentencing guidelines were developed but didn't have an impact on the actual sentencing. Um, Efforts were made to better alternative sanctions, but they didn't develop as they hoped. So basically, the last attempt was the creation of punishment units, but it didn't become part of federal guidelines. Okay, so next we have types. Um, so there are many types, and there's probably even, not probably, I'm sure there's more types than the one that I've included. I have included, most of the ones that I've included are used here. Not all of them are used in that exact way, but we see a resemblance of what it is. Like, for example, the day fines, we can see a resemblance to something that we do have here. And then I will be presenting them in order from least severe to most severe. So mediation is the first one. And mediations are meetings of victims with offenders to try and resolve. The next is restitutions, which are payments of damages or restitution of stolen objects, or working for the victim as a reparation. Day fines are individualized fines defined by the seriousness of the offense and the offender's financial capacity. Community service is defined as useful, demanding, unpaid work as reparation to the victim or the community. And it also replaces prison for more serious offenders. Day reporting centers were created to increase supervision and to replace detention. So we're getting more into the more serious kinds of alternatives. And electronic monitoring. The offender is detained in his home or her home and controlled by an electronic device. Intensive supervision programs consists of a number of punishment options under the very intensive control of probation officers. Boot camps are mostly for young adults, and they're characterized by a military regime where it's very harsh because even the slightest infraction is severely punished. And the last one, which it can differ to different people where it lies on this list, but the reason I put it for last, which is shaming, is because there is concern by, which I will discuss later, but there is some concerns by the practices of shaming, the impact that it can have on society. But basically, shaming is a group of sanctions that shine a spotlight on offenders in order to warn others of antisocial activity and of miscreant perpetrating the act. The objectives. One goal of alternative sanctions is to reduce the prison population. But more often than not, alternative sanctions are used in a combination with prison time, therefore not achieving the purpose of an alternative sanction. It's in the name, alternative. You want to replace prison with, say, electronic monitoring. If you do both, then how can you really know if it's the electronic monitoring or the prison time that really had the effect on the offender? If they don't reoffend, how do you know which one was the one who caused this reaction? You don't. To really reduce, well, the reduction of cost, to really reduce the cost, you need to calculate and to compare the cost of alternative sanctions with detention, which is why the whole reduction of prison population doesn't work. And this is hard because there are so many variables to account for that only seeing it in action can bring credible results. But because of the issue we have with the previous goal, this isn't really possible. But the last goal is to reduce the rate of recidivism. And this brings us to our next slide. Treatment. So there are 4 different treatments. One of them is kind of like an idea, not an idea, but an ideal. 2 of them are actual propositions initiatives that were made, and one of them is this incredible treatment program for women. So the very first one is matching offender to program, and it works just the way it sounds. You match the offender characteristics with the program features, and that is how it should be for every single alternative. It shouldn't just be because this is what's working for one person. We should look overall at the characteristics of this person and the actual features of this program, so you can match and say, well, maybe this would be good for this person, because again, what's good for one person might not be good for the next one. Even though they might have committed the same crime, it doesn't mean that they have the same motives. It doesn't mean they have the same things that drive them. So why treat them the same? And the way that they do this whole matching is by asking 2 questions. And this is, what is the risk level of the offender, and what is his or her profile? The next the treatment I'm going to be talking about is California's Proposition 36, which is also known as the Substance Abuse and Crime Prevention Act. It allows first and second time nonviolent, simple drug possession offenders the option of substance abuse treatment instead of prison time. And the other one is this proposition in Pennsylvania that the DOJ financed. And it's a program that diverted nonviolent drug and alcohol dependent offenders directly to treatment after arrest. So, whereas in California's proposition, it was a choice, this one, if are arrested for violent, for nonviolent drug or alcohol related crime, then you are automatically diverted to a different self-punishment treatment option. And the very last one, which I was very happy to find, and it made me very happy to hear about, was the Crane House Residential Community Corrections. And this one is designed to accommodate female offenders and their young children while keeping the women under community corrections custody. In this house, they have access to different projects like parenting classes, job counseling, job placement, a GD program, as well as other types of counseling. And the most interesting part is that they have a very low recidivism rate. Conclusion and implication. So the conclusion of this whole research was that there is a need for substitutions of alternative sanctions. Like, if we're actually going to use alternative sanctions, we might as well try and implement them and let them work. We're already seeing how the rise in crimes are not getting lower and the recidivism rates are not getting lower. So I think there's a big consensus where we think that maybe trying an alternative will not damage our system much more. So we have mostly learned that what works for this class of offender is a combination of restrictions coupled with treatment. So our focus is nonviolent drug offenders. And it is important to realize that these types of offenders need restriction and, a little bit of incapacitation, but not just that. It's taken another step to realizing that they also need treatment. And with this, I think it's safe to say that nonviolent drug offenders who are given treatment and alternative sanctions are more likely to be rehabilitated and have lower recidivism rates. So the future implications in this research, it's imperative that more studies are conducted on different types of alternative sanctions. We need to know more. And that more empirical evidence, actual evidence that we can prove that no one can say, no, that's not it, is sought out. We need more empirical evidence. It is also very important for more propositions, but not only propositions, the enthusiasm to push for these types of alternatives to be used more often, to fight a little harder in our system to actually get them through. And this concludes our presentation.